This morning in the workshop, in the final session of the workshop I've been leading, I came to a realization that my work among Quakers, a lot of the time, is reminding us what we already know. I want to start this afternoon sharing about New Zealand Quakers in the early 1970s, remembering what they already knew. In the course of being very concerned about the threat of a South African rugby team coming to New Zealand in order to play against the New Zealand rugby team. And traditionally, South African rugby and New Zealand rugby teams tend to be among the top of the heap. So there's always a lot of curiosity, who's really best. But the thing about that sports event, the prospect of that sports event was that, of course, in South Africa at that time, rugby was an apartheid sport. It was organized according to apartheid principles. And many people, a majority of New Zealanders, felt it was wrong to import apartheid sport, even though they were so curious about who would be better. So Quakers were in the middle of all that ferment about import apartheid sport. No, that would be wrong. We don't want to be complicit with racism. And yet, on the other hand, how to stop that from happening. The government was unwilling to stop that from happening at that time. And then New Zealand Quakers remembered what they already knew, which was that people power, or nonviolent direct action, can make the difference in many situations. So they got in touch with me and said, please come over and offer a series of trainings to the top leadership in the anti-apartheid movement here in New Zealand on how to do nonviolent direct action. They're looking for strategy. There's tremendous passion, there's tremendous commitment, but there's a bit of a strategic void, and they could use your training. I said, fine, no problem. I'd be honored, actually, to come and work with people. And so I got to go over and do that. There was an effort by the right wing of New Zealand to stop me from coming. They passed a petition around the country urging the government to prevent this well-known international terrorist from coming to New Zealand. And however, civil liberties in New Zealand are in pretty good shape, and they did not stop me from coming. Although when I got there, because by that time I'd become notorious, after traveling for whatever, 26 hours or something across the Pacific, I walk out of the airport and there's this huge bevy of media people, TV, microphones in my face, and all these efforts to trick me with questions that would enable me to look like a fool from the outset. And I can only say that God was with me, because my brains were not. But we had a marvelous time with 3 different training camps spouted throughout New Zealand. New Zealand Quakers took excellent care of me, moved me around the country, and so we got to work with the leadership of the whole thing. Before I left, the Quaker, Michael and Marilyn Payne, maybe some of you know them, said, we've just heard from the New Zealand Police Commissioner, wants to see you, and we really need to do that. And I said, no problem, no problem. And they said, it has to be after hours because this is a private visit. I said, all right, whatever, whatever. So we went in, and the guy said, you understand this is not an official visit, no media attention. If the media get hold of it, I will deny it. I will say, as a private citizen, I can see whoever I want to see, and you're just in here for drinks, and so on. But he said, of course, we've had a spy in all of your training camps, and so I've had very interesting reports on what you've been doing, but I just had to have a one-on-one encounter with this strange American. And so we had a very interesting conversation. And so, and he was also very intent on bragging to me about that New Zealand police do not carry guns. They really hate the idea of guns being around in New Zealand. In fact, when Vice President Agnew for the US came to New Zealand, they insisted that the Secret Service not carry guns when they went around with Agnew. And at first the response of Agnew was, well, then I won't come into the country without my guns. And they said, well, then don't come in. And so it was a very convivial kind of conversation. So I said, okay, so you know what I don't know and what Michael Payne doesn't know, which is what's the government going to do about this this apartheid import prospect. And he said, "Oh, you won." We haven't done anything yet. It's also been planning and training and training and planning. He said, "Oh no, I have to recommend to the government. It's a national police force here, and my word is extremely important. And I'm going to tell the government that we just can't allow the South Africans to come in." I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Because the strategy you came up with is one that we can't cope with." And I said, "I don't understand." He said, "Well, we just can't marshal enough police. If," he said, "you had chosen a strategy that would have centralized all your forces in a particular space, we could have brought all our forces together and arrested all of you, thrown you all in jail, and we would have won. And allowed the games to continue. But the fact that you've chosen a decentralized strategy that would have you be at the games all over the country, we can't disperse our forces that well, that far. We'd be overextended, we would lose, we would end up being a laughingstock, and so we're not going to do it." And I said, "But I don't understand." I became sympathetic. I said, "Surely, well, couldn't you deputize additional police in order to be able to cope with this problem?" He said, "No, because the kinds of people who volunteer to be deputies, we'd end up having to watch them to keep them under control, because that would be a big problem." And I said, "Well, you know, I was trying to problem solve. I'm a habitual problem solver." And so I said, "Well, how about the troops? Why not call out the Army?" And he said, "Well, they tried that in Australia a couple of years ago. The Army, they killed some people, killed some demonstrators. The government fell. My government does not want to fall." So no, that won't work. "No, you won. You won," he said. Okay. So nobody had to do a single bit of knowledge. Turned out that the government just announced, "We will not have apartheid sport," and of course took entire credit for it. Yeah. Right, as being a brilliantly humane and non-racist government, took entire credit for it. But that's what governments do when they're forced to do something. Then they take the credit. Anyway. And I thought, well, this was a very brilliant move on the part of New Zealand Quakers to remember the Quaker DNA, that when there's an issue that involves a need to mobilize a lot of power to emphasize the truth in the situation, the claims of justice, then turn to nonviolent direct action, and that's the way to go. While I happened to be there, the IMF happened to be there at the same time, the International Monetary Fund. And in reading the daily papers, I found this out. And one of the dispatches in the newspapers revealed what the International Monetary Fund consultants were telling the New Zealand government to do in order to really hype their economy, really move their economy forward. Which was, IMF said, "You have the big mistake of having in New Zealand a full employment economy. Bad idea. Bad idea. International investors are not interested in investing in countries that have full employment economies. You've got to get unemployment in New Zealand if you want to attract more multinationals to come to New Zealand and work. Because having unemployment in a country means then that it weakens the unions, because if a union goes on strike, if there are all these unemployed people who are willing to be replacement workers while the workers are on strike, then that weakens the effectiveness of strikes. It weakens the effectiveness of the unions, and international investors want weak unions, of course, because then they can pay lower wages and they can make more money. So it's only sensible. And actually, that is mainstream economics. Mainstream economics is about unemployment. Very important to have unemployment. So you New Zealanders are off on really the wrong track. Well, I left, while this consultation was going on. I didn't know what was going to happen, but actually IMF's advice was followed, and New Zealand gave up their full employment policy. Now, one of the things we know about employment is that when unemployment rises, and with the poverty that goes along with that, also it's clear that domestic abuse statistics go up, because frustrated parents take it out on their children, frustrated husbands take it out on their wives. Also, the suicide rate goes up. So it's totally predictable that social pathology increases with every percent of unemployment that increases. And we also know, I mean, this is a big tip-off for those of you who didn't know, that the amount of employment or unemployment in an economy is decided upon by the people who run the economy, by the people at the top. And so it's a matter of choice. Those countries that decided to have full employment economies do that, and other countries, like my own, that have not decided to do that, don't do that. The people at the top make those decisions. And so there was the social pathology like beckoning. Oh my gosh, there's going to be this increased suffering in New Zealand. I realized once I got back and found out what had happened. And I thought, oh, are Quakers going to remember what they already know with regard to this threat? Came out real strong on the threat from South Africa. Are they going to also come out real strong with regard to the threat from the owning class of New Zealand in its decision to have unemployment? And instead, there's another thread in the Quaker legacy, which got pulled on that occasion, which was Quakers as the people who clean up the mess, or try to, in society. Right? Social pathology increases. Okay, we help to create suicide hotlines, domestic abuse intervention, set up rape prevention centers, or counseling, that kind of thing. And we do have a long and distinguished history of trying to help people clean up the mess. But I couldn't help thinking that's just such a contrasting response, right? On the one hand, acting in a really powerful way. New Zealand Quakers acting in a very powerful way. We have this thing happening, okay, use people power and nonviolent direct action, bam, we get it. And then the next thing that happens, somehow forgetting about how to be powerful, and instead clean up the mess approach. Now, the cleaning up of the mess approach, I observe to be very contrary to the way Quakers try to operate their own families. How many times have I heard a Quaker parent say to their child, clean up your own mess? Right? I mean, we don't run our families that way, that if somebody makes a mess, we say, no, 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 don't, come on over here, help us clean up this mess that Susie made, or that Johnny made. We Quakers tend, I mean, this is my observation of Quaker parenting, is very much about responsibility. You take responsibility for the mess you make. And so it's such a sudden putting a norm, a valuable norm, I think, because I'm a responsibility freak myself. So I'm just struck by taking that norm of teaching people responsibility, putting it on the shelf, and saying, okay, you folks who run the economy, you can make a mess, and we'll just get right in there and clean it up for you. What an odd and powerless response for us to make. So it seems to me that the stakes are actually much higher than we may think. That is, at first sight, yes, it looks like compassion. People are in trouble, suicide rates going up, domestic abuse rates going up, drinking, alcoholism going up, and so on and so on. So it just looks like a wonderful, compassionate response on the part of Quakers to get in there, roll up our sleeves, help people out. Who can complain about helping people out? But really, if you take a step back and look at this from the perspective of what is actually going on in terms of power, it's embarrassing.